muted the participants today to reduce the audio interference so that you can hear myself and Marta loud and clear. We would encourage you also to submit questions during the webinar via the chat window in the GoToMeeting panel. So please go ahead and feel free to do that whenever a question comes up. And we also wanted to let you know that we are recording the webinar today so that it can be archived on the MSP platform website. And we can also make the slides available upon request. Okay, so with that, I'll go ahead and briefly describe the structure of the webinar. I will give a brief introduction to the MSP platform and the MSP for Blue Growth study, and then I will turn it over to Marta, who will introduce the sector fiches that were developed as part of the MSP for Blue Growth study. And we will also have about 30 minutes at the end for questions from all of you to be sent in through the chat box, and for Marta and I to hopefully provide some answers. Okay, so just to give a brief introduction to the MSP platform and our services. This might be a small repetition for those of you who joined our previous webinar 2 weeks ago on the Visions Handbook, so I'll try and be as concise as possible. The MSP platform provides technical assistance to EU member states and to the European Commission in the implementation of the EU MSP directive. And this directive states that all coastal EU member states are required to prepare cross-sectoral maritime spatial plans by 2021. Small disclaimer that Marta and I are not EU employees, so the views and information we are sharing today do not represent the European Commission's official opinion. So the services that the platform provides includes access to a team of dedicated experts who provide advice and knowledge on MSP-specific topics. We also have a very extensive website with diverse resources available about maritime spatial planning. And we also run a question and answer service where our expert team can answer specific questions that come in a relatively short time frame. One of our other main services, which relates to this webinar today, is that we develop technical studies intended to fill knowledge gaps. And this webinar will cover one output from the MSP for Blue Growth study published earlier this year. And we also organize a series of events to support knowledge exchange, including workshops and conferences, as well as the member state expert group on MSP meetings. So a little bit about how we are organized. We have expertise distributed throughout Europe with focal points in each European sea basin and central offices in Berlin and Brussels. I myself am based at our central office in Berlin at s.Pro Sustainable Projects. And Marta is part of the ECORIS team, and she is based in Spain. And you can see the names of our various experts who cover the various EU member states. In addition to this regional distribution, our team also has expertise on various themes and sectors. So if you have any specific questions about the sectors that Marta will talk about in a little bit, we're also happy to directly connect you with our sector expert from within the MSP platform team. So this is a preview of what our website looks like if you have not had a chance to check it out yet. It's fairly extensive with a large collection of practical experiences related to conducting MSP, and a section on the sector fiches, which Marta will present. We also have overviews of MSP progress in the member states and at the Sea Basin level, and we promote funding opportunities, news, and events related to MSP. You can also follow us on Twitter, U_MSP_platform, and you can subscribe to our monthly newsletter as well. So to provide some context for Marta's presentation, as I already mentioned, the sector fiches she will describe were developed as one of the outputs of the MSP for Blue Growth technical study, which we worked on in 2017 and was published earlier this year. And the study aims to provide information on how MSP can help member states deliver sustainable growth for their maritime economies. It provides member states with practical guidance in 3 distinct aspects of MSP, organized around these study questions presented on the slide. One being how to develop a vision for maritime space that can then be used in MSP, and this resulted in the development of a handbook for developing visions in MSP, which was presented by our colleague Ivana Lucic 2 weeks ago, and a recording of that webinar is available on our website for those who are unable to attend. The second question, which we will focus on today, regarding what kind of future trends impact on sector development and how do they influence the MSP process. Marta will present the sector fiches and information. And then finally, a third question on how can MSP authorities monitor whether they are on the right track with their MSP objectives. And for this, we developed a handbook on developing a system of indicators, which we will present in 2 weeks. These 3 separate outputs are intended to be used on their own, and they, of course, are intended to be adapted to a given context where MSP is underway. So while the study was really built around these 3 separate outputs, there are some main conclusions that can be drawn out of the MSP for Growth study, starting with that visions are really about planning for the future, and they can provide an overarching framework for integrated maritime policy in general and promote collaboration among the sectors. Another main finding is the importance of communicating the benefits of MSP to sectors and how it can be a tool to support both emerging and mature sectors. And finally, that indicators can help link MSP and blue growth processes. Of course, while also acknowledging that MSP has limitations to be kept in mind and can't address all of the issues related to use of maritime space. So just a brief reminder that this webinar is part of a series that we're organizing. As I mentioned, the recording is available from the previous webinar on the Visions Handbook. And the next webinar in this series is about developing MSP indicators to be held on the 5th of December at the same time. And I encourage you to go ahead and register for that webinar if you have not yet already, as well as share information about the webinar and recordings of the already held webinars with your colleagues. Okay, so with that, I am going to go ahead and pass the controls to Marta so that she can go ahead and share information with us about the maritime sectors investigated as part of the study.
Thank you, Claire. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you everyone for being here today. Let me just shrink this. Okay. So as Claire has said, I'm going to present like the second part of this blue growth study that we did, in which we developed the some sector fishes for each of the maritime sectors. Let me go. Yeah, there. Okay, so in these sector fishes, we try to see how what was the stage of the maritime sectors in with regards to maritime spatial planning, the current one, and what would be the future trends that could affect these sectors and therefore influence into MSP processes. For that, as I said, this is the second stage of this blue growth study that we did. And we developed some sector fishes. Currently, we developed 9 of them for these fishy maritime sectors that you are seeing here. We also are providing a website under the MSP platform where all the information along these sectors is included. And there, if you click at each of these sectors, you can find another website with some short descriptions of these sector fishes. And you can, if you click in here, download the full sector fish, which happens to look something like this. So you will be able to download 9 sector fish for the 9 sectors that we studied. This study task 2 was aiming for filling the existing knowledge gap that were in what regards to maritime sectors. When an MSP planner starts working, they do not need to be knowledgeable in all the maritime sectors. So we wanted to provide a basic structure throughout the extensive review with some basic facts of each of the maritime sectors. Then we wanted to see what were the spatial implications of those maritime sectors, the current and the future ones, and end up providing some recommendations or guidance for MSP planners and member states. For that, as I said, we analyzed 9 sectors. We group them into mature sectors such as shipping and ports, offshore oil and gas, and fishing. Some that are kind of mature but growing, like offshore wind, coastal and maritime tourism, marine aquaculture, and pipelines and cables. And others that are kind of emerging, such as tidal and wave energy and marine mining. Marine aggregates, we put it along with marine mining, even though marine aggregates we could consider it also as a mature activity. And we prepare some basic sector fishes that were brought into the 11th and 12th of October on 2017 meeting in Brussels, where some of these sector experts were at the round tables, and we discussed the how they seem to look at the future trends into these maritime sectors, what would be those spatial implications of those future trends, and how could MSP planners include these sectors in MSP processes along with these spatial implications. All the sector fishes have this structure. They have 8 sections. The first one is the basic facts. Then we go into trying to find a typology of the sector, so trying to divide the sector into different typologies. Then we look at the relationship between the sectors and marine spatial planning, the interactions of these sectors with other maritime sectors. We look at recommendations that we could give for MSP planners towards including these sectors into marine spatial plans. And then we provide a set of resources, legal framework, actors, initiatives, and a selection of literature for those who would like to keep looking at these maritime sectors and knowing more about those. We also provide a list of acronyms and references of each of them. At this presentation, I will basically talk about the relationship between the sector and MSP in what I call the planning criteria current one and the future one. the interaction with other sectors, and I will talk about recommendations for MSP planners. So let me just get out of this presentation and show you one of these sector fiches so that you can see how it looks like. You can download them, as I said, from the website as a PDF, and you will obtain this PDF. For example, this is example for cables and pipelines. The first section with the basic facts that we have grouped. Second stage, sorry, with the typology of the sector. And then what I call the present criteria and future criteria. So what are the spatial implications, current ones, of the sector? What would be the future spatial implications looking at future developments of those sectors? And then section 4 looks at the interaction of this sector, specific sector, in this case, cables and pipelines, with the other maritime sectors. And the section 5, we provide a few recommendations for MSP planners. Then on resources, as you see, we have the legal frameworks for each of the case studies, some list of actors of these maritime sectors, European ones, and some initiatives and references. Okay, so if we go back to the presentation, we can start with the first of the sector fishes. So as I said, we start with those that we consider mature: shipping, ports, oil and gas extraction, and fisheries. So with regards to shipping and ports, we know that shipping, maritime transport accounts for almost 70%, 75%, sorry, of all the traded goods in Europe. And also because we are not just talking about shipping or transport of cargo, but also about maritime transport of passengers, and cruise shipping is also included in this maritime activity. There is about 400 million passengers that go through European ports on a yearly basis. So far, when we want to consider shipping and ports into a marine spatial plan, we need to consider the typology of the shipping, as I said, cargo, passengers, or in this case, if it's cruise shipping. And that will definitely imply what is the vessel size and the spatial requirements that those vessel size have for maneuvering. It will also guide us on what is the buffer zones that we need, not just for maneuvering, but also with regards when they are shipping into shipping lanes. And we need to ensure that we have adequate depth so that these vessels can perform their activity. And if we look at future trends, we observe that there will be an increase in freight volume. So there would be much more shipping transport increase. The vessel sizes will also increase in the future, and there will be an increase in what we call short shipping, which are those shipping that occurs between closest ports. However, in terms of future spatial requirements, there is still uncertainty on if the existing port infrastructure would be ready for this increase in shipping transport. There is also uncertainty in how extreme weather events could affect these shipping routes into rerouting this, deviation of these routes, and even for seeking refuge if the extreme events are quite important. There are some considerations to be taken if the new routes, shipping routes are open, such as the Arctic route. And with regards to technological development, the development of autonomous vessels, those vessels that would not require to be manned guided, it is still uncertain how this could affect existing MSPs or future MSPs, because they might require their own shipping lanes. In what regards to interaction of shipping and ports with other sectors, we see that there might be basically some synergies with all the different maritime activities that already use shipping or already use the ports as the starting point of their activity or at some part of their value chain. But there also might be conflicts in what regards to uh, collision and noise, and even the same use of space between different activities. We therefore suggested a few recommendations for MSP planners to include shipping and ports into the marine spatial plans, that they should start by considering existing IMO routes, so existing the shipping routes that already exist, but leaving enough space for these future developments of shipping, considering the shipping and the shipping 3 dimensions, the trajectory, wide, and depth. Also using tools such as AIS data to know exactly what is the spatial requirements of each of these typologies of shipping. And because it is not just a member state activity that occurs in their exclusive economic zone, it just goes wider, that they should cooperate with member and non-member states, neighbor countries, in order to have their MSP plans, MS plans aligned along together. Now we would move to the second of the sector fishes. We talked about offshore oil and gas. It is also a mature activity that is, in this case, locked physically to a specific location where their resource is occurring. Therefore, their reallocation, their reallocation is quite hard. There are different planning criteria currently, depending on the type of installations. The type of installations can be distinguished into conventional fixed platforms, tension-legs platforms, semi-submersible platforms, drill ships, and all of those will have different spatial requirements. And there is the system of directional drilling has already reduced the amount of surface structure required for hydrocarbon extraction activities, since now many wells can be operated from a single platform at a distance of several kilometers. So there is no need to have many platforms, and that has reduced their spatial requirement. In what regards to the future of this maritime activity, we foresee that it will not grow much, but that the future development of this activity will go into designing new platforms more adapted to the coexistence to other users. Also, because it is a very mature activity, the activity is going through a decommissioning phase. So the MSP plans would also need to look at how the decommissioning of these platforms could best serve and not create spatial conflicts by the using of these platforms for carbon storage, mussel production, and other synergies with aquaculture, tourism, etc. Also, as I said, finding synergies with conservation and MPA's efforts, and engaging with the oil and gas community, and also with the wider stakeholder into what might require the social acceptability of this maritime sector into the future. In what regards to impacts or interactions with other sectors, we see that basically there are many conflicts with other activities, especially when it comes to sharing space. But all these new multi-use possibilities of decommissioning of wells might also create synergies with many of these uses. Also, the sharing of some of the supply chain material, and the knowledge existing in offshore oil and gas could also help moving offshore to other maritime activities. So the final recommendations that we made for MSP planners with regards to including offshore oil and gas sector into their MSP plans was to engage with the sector and their knowledge, to manage the decommissioning effects that that we see that are the future for also this maritime activity, and to explore further coexistence with uses. If we will move to the third mature activity, which is fishing, currently fishing is mostly planned around historical claims. It is a very highly diversified sector with different types of fishing gears and fishing types, which also allows this sector to be a bit more adaptive to MSP. The location of this activity is usually given through VMS data, even though a lot of these fishing activities might not use VMS data and we might be lacking their information. There is new management approaches in what regards to planning for fisheries that include the environmental characteristics of the fishing, including their nursery grounds, their fishing adult phase, the spawning phase, and including also the cultural and social aspects of fishing, because fisheries have also an important role in maintaining cultural seascapes. In what regards to the future of these maritime sectors, it is foreseen very important technological innovations on the sectors towards a decrease in discards and improvement into the sustainability of the gears being used. However, it is also envisioned that there might be a fleet reduction, so a reduction in the number of fishing vessels, even though the existing ones might increase in size in order to move to more offshore areas. And it is also envisioned that into these management approaches, fisheries it's already has started, but it will increase, including the sustainability of the whole fishing activity with this spawning and nursery grounds. However, as fishing has been declining in the latest years, it has been left aside of port infrastructure, so that needs to be included into future developments. And also, again, there is uncertainty in how extreme weather events and climate change could impact the species distribution and therefore the activity of fisheries. Fishing activity mainly has synergies and also impacts with other activities. If you want to go in depth into these things, you can look at the full sector Fiches. But just to point out a few, there might be synergies with regards, for example, with marine aquaculture, but also conflicts because of the scapies, introduction of diseases. There might be synergies with offshore wind because of the structures could act as artificial reefs, but also they will conflict because of the space, because of the habitat change and noise that these offshore wind energies might impose. So as recommendations with regards to this maritime sector, we see that the sector is quite fragmented because of this diversification. So we are recommending that this fragmentation it's solved throughout coming together organizations and talking together so that they would have a single voice in these MSP processes. Also to engage with the sector and talk about all these issues on spawning areas, adults areas, and to include other fishing activities that might not be already include, apart from artisanal fisheries and industrial fisheries, such as recreational fisheries and other tourism fisheries activities, such as pesca tourism. Now we are going to talk about other maritime uses that are well, growing and increasing recently, such as offshore wind. The offshore wind capacity has increased since 2000, and it's envisioned that the total installed capacity is expected to grow by 2030. In what regards to the spatial constraints of this maritime activity, it differs depending on the planning stage. So if it is at the developing phase, it is at the location phase, already at the installation phase, there might require different spatial allocations. Also, we need to consider that it's not just the monopile and the turbines area that we need to account for when planning for the maritime spatial plans, including this sector, but also the connections, substations, transmission stations, the connection into land through a grid. And also what we see in here down below, the wake effect of these turbines that could cause turbulence either in the sea surface area or in the nearby areas of these monopiles and turbines. In the future, it is foreseen that wind turbines will become larger and will move further offshore into using different technologies, floating devices, and therefore they will move farther offshore thanks to these technological developments. In what regards to the interaction to other sectors, we observe that offshore wind has a lot of synergies with other maritime uses, especially if we aim for this coexistence or multi-use of the areas. However, there is still uncertainty in how these may create conflicts with, for example, shipping radars, creating interferences with electromagnetic fields that might have, even with impairing the sight, so a visual impact that they may have for tourism and even for other shipping activities. Therefore, the recommendations we gave for MSP planners for this maritime sector were to increase these and seek these opportunities that offshore wind has for multi-use and for exploring these synergies with other sectors, to involve stakeholders both at the offshore wind community, but also outside other maritime activities, so that they will not see this maritime activity as conflicting with them. And also to promote the existing coherence and comprehensive political and financial frameworks. The electricity market in Europe is foreseen to go more and more towards renewable energies, and this could stimulate the existing locations of offshore wind farms, but also new locations of offshore wind farms. At the same time, financial developments of the offshore wind energy market have also an special impact, because the reducement in development costs and the increased confidence of the economic potential of this type of maritime activity has already engaged with pensions funds and banks that are now starting to invest into renewable energies and going into offshore wind energies. Another sector that is mature but also growing is coastal and maritime tourism. In what regards to the current planning criteria, it's basically looking at nearshore and coastline areas between 0 and a few kilometers depth. But the planning criteria is also looking at the different seasonalities of this activity. There are many challenges for planning for coastal and maritime tourism. In the future, MS plans should consider the ongoing growth of tourism, the new necessities that this growth will imply for infrastructure, and that the activity is much more getting diversified into different sub-activities and different value chains. But at the same time that this diversification is occurring, coastal tourism and maritime tourism, it's also becoming a niche tourism with some areas of high volume and high value areas, as we can see in this image here, some low value areas with low volume areas. And all these things need to be assessed by each of the MSP planners in order to plan for these future developments in tourism. In what regards to synergies with other sectors, we've observed that there are many synergies with other maritime activities, unless they are occurring in the same space. Even though we are talking about nearshore and coastal areas, and these other maritime activities that we are mentioning do not usually occur in these areas. So the conflicts are much more minimized. There might be also conflicts between recreational tourism activities, because anchoring of recreational activities is not permitted, or there might be pollution coming from aquaculture sites, etc., that might end up affecting tourism. Looking at the recommendations that we gave for MSP planners to include coastal and maritime tourism, we recommend to consider land-sea interactions. Land-sea aspects are really important because in coastal and maritime tourism, most of the needed infrastructure is land-based. We also recommend to consider the environmental impacts of tourism as a two-way process, the impacts that tourism creates on the environment, but also the impacts that having a bad environment could create onto the maritime activity of tourism. Also to look at how future effects such as climate change or increasing erosion might affect tourism in terms of increasing the need of coastal defense, increasing the need of sand regeneration. And as this sector is quite diversified and it's getting much more diversified into different value chains, this sector could also become fragmented and not having a single voice into these MSP plans. So coming together and having a single voice would also be recommended into these MSP processes.
Hi, Marta, it's Claire. Just before you move on to the next sector, I think the coastal and marine tourism sector relates especially to a question that came in from Quado, which is, in analyzing current and future trends of user activities, did you consider how the 4 seasons in a year affect the maritime activities and how to allocate the spatial temporary activities in marine space?
Yes, so
for tourism, this would be especially relevant. So maybe you could talk a bit about that.
Sure. So as we mentioned, the tourism, it has a quite important seasonality, as you were mentioning. So these 4 seasons seasonality, we didn't look specifically on each of them. We just suggested that they should look at it, even though there is a few information that we found on how not just taking the spatial considerations of MSP, but also the temporal considerations could improve MSP plans. Right now, including temporal dimensions into MSP plans has not been implemented into existing MSPs or into proposed MSPs by member states, but obviously it's one of the recommendations that we give. Thanks for the question.
Yeah, great. Thank you for answering that. And yeah, let's continue. And just looking at the time, maybe we should also save some time for questions before we wrap up by 5. Thanks.
Yes. So I will try to move a bit faster. Basically, the next a few sectors that we are looking at, the next one is marine aquaculture. We also foresee that it is a growing sector with a large traction, both in Europe but also worldwide. Mostly the spatial requirements are dealing with the species type and their physical and environmental characteristics, but also with the technology deployed. If it's for shellfish, it's for finfish, or algae, or integrated multi-trophic aquaculture, they will require different spatial requirements. Obviously, when this happens around islands and short coastlines, their spatial impact might also differ because they would have a narrower space. In these future trends of increasing demand of fish proteins and also the expansion of aquacultures, the possibility of new cultivation of species, and also there is the need then for the coexistence of this maritime activity with other uses. As they are trying to move also offshore, away from coastlines because of the conflicts that they had with other sectors such as tourism because of pollution that they may cause. Also with fisheries, displacing fisheries. Introduction of diseases because of these new escapees or coming from aquaculture. So these kind of conflicts also should be looked at with other sectors. In what regards to recommendations of maritime aquaculture, for MSP planners, we recommend that they take into account, of course, the physical factors in order to allocate the most suitable areas for aquaculture, but also having into mind the resilience that these habitats could have in what regards to climate change that might shift some of these physical conditions and therefore shift the sector's activity. Also to introduce cyclic assessments because of this shifting of the environmental factors, and to improve the social licensing, social permitting, and social perception of this maritime activity, which at some places in Europe is not well perceived yet. One of the also emerging activities is the last one, pipelines and cables, because they are increasingly becoming important in light of the global communications, but also into connecting these other new activities such as offshore wind, tidal wave, and other offshore activities into land-based one. They need to have different exclusion zones areas, and there is also need for not just the trenching of the cable, but also some space for bundling, substations, and interconnections to be taken into account when accounting for these spatial considerations. With regards to impacts of pipelines and cables with other sectors, there might be synergies, especially because they occur on the seabed and other activities are occurring in sea surface areas. However, there are these exclusion zones and these other space conflicts, because when you do have destruction of some resources, you could not have the pipelines and cables. You cannot anchor around pipelines and cables, and there is still some uncertainties on the effects of electromagnetic effects of pipelines and cables into the biota. as recommendations for including pipelines and cables into MSP plan. We suggested to increase the synergies with other uses and to increase the technological innovations to reduce the footprint that the laying of the pipelines and cables and also the repairing activities could have into the environment. And now we are moving to the last three activities, that are sort of more emerging ones. This is tidal and wave. As we can see, there is a few, it is a newcomer, but it is a sector whose potential for development in the future might increase also because of these efforts of the European to have more clean and renewable energy. They should be taken apart from offshore wind energies because of their spatial requirements. Tidal energy occurs at very specific places, and wave and wind might occur and co-occur in the same areas, but they would have different spatial requirements. However, there is an increasing demand for space coming from some studies in the following 35 years, and this should be taken into account. As I said, you could have synergies also with this maritime activity and other maritime activities, but there might be also conflicts in what regards to collision and entanglements, the resuscitation of some sediments, etc. In what regards to some recommendations for this maritime activity, we highlighted to have sufficient planning time. There is still quite time for getting consents, licensing, and investment in this type of activities. And then that this should be considered as different technologies apart from offshore wind energy, as we said, and to try to promote synergies with these energies and other maritime activities. And last but not least is the maritime aggregates and maritime mining activity. The maritime aggregates activity is quite mature and it has happened into many places, and the maritime mining, it's more the newcomer and an emerging activity in marine areas that should be also looked at when planning, when creating marine spatial plans. They are locked to the resource area, so their reallocation is quite difficult. And also, it might look like the allocation zones for maritime mining are quite big, but what they are doing is just making bigger allocation zones that where the actual extraction will occur in order for this what is called mineral safeguarding. So, having said that, in this future increase of maritime mining and maritime aggregate extraction because of climate change, coastal defense, the need for sand, the need for new minerals into high-tech industry. We foresee that even though it seems like there are many conflicts with other activities, there might be also synergies because of this multi-use of other activities could come from a temporal perspective. They might not happen while the maritime mining or extraction of aggregates is occurring, but they might happen right after that. So the recommendations for MSP planners to include maritime aggregates and maritime mining was to include this temporal perspective of this sector, and also to try to align the planning horizons of this activity, which is usually around 30 years to try and plan for an area to be mined, with those that MSP cycles have, which are usually 6 years. So in general, we see that there is an extraordinary diversity of spatial implications with regards to different maritime activities, that there is growing activities, there is mature activities and emerging activities, and there is still uncertainty on how MSP could deal with these emerging activities and their impact. Also, there is uncertainty into how to forecast some of these developments into this global economy that we are living, because impacts into one might end up impacting. So a growing activity in offshore wind energy might also increase the activity into pipelines and cables and so on. So some cutting issues that we had that we thought that needed to be addressed in the future is how we can also address the cumulative impacts of all these activities, what kind of information we are not having from these activities that we like to have in order to decrease that uncertainty, and how can encourage these maritime activities businesses to provide that information so that MSP planners can create better plans. As we say, these are the publications, the sector fiches, of which all this information that I told you about much more detail, and you can just find it in the website. And with that, I'll keep the floor if you have any questions.
Great. Thank you, Marta, for sharing all of this information. It was really interesting to hear again about all of these sectors and their spatial requirements, as well as their potential future needs. And it was quite a bit to share. So once again, I would encourage everyone to check out the sector section on the MSP platform website for more detail. In the remaining couple of minutes, we will take your questions. One question that has come in already regards our analysis of future trends, and a question regarding trade-offs. Did we encounter a situation where one activity was developing at a faster pace than another activity, and there had to be trade-offs made to make space for the activity that was growing more quickly than another sector?
Yes, we did found, as I said, we organized them into these growing and emerging ones because we saw that a few of them were moving quite fast, like occurs with offshore wind energy. What is happening is that the licensing process, consenting process, and exit and even investment process goes faster into these ones. So therefore, they're able to start their activity faster. What we observed is that the other ones are lacking this kind of political and financial support or structure, and that's why they were moving quite faster. So yeah, we definitely observed that.
Yeah, I think it sounds like that was certainly somewhat the case for the offshore wind sector, where there's been quite a bit of investment.
Yeah.
Okay. One other question is, what are the sectors that could potentially increase the most in the near future and require an increase in their spatial demand? So out of the 9 key sectors that we presented today, which of those do you think is moving the
Yeah.
fastest and taking up the most space?
European-wise, the ones that foresee more development are offshore wind in the north and aquaculture in the Mediterranean. Even though I would not say that they will require much more space because of these co-use and efforts, the technological efforts for reducing their spatial, but definitely there will be some increase in the spatial demands.
Okay. You mentioned co-use. Are there some examples that you would like to highlight from the interactions among the sectors regarding co-location and co-use?
So basically, this is still at the research and project phase. There are a few examples of co-location or co-use. The European project Muses it's already looking at these multi-use platforms. And there is quite a few highlights on which sectors with what could work for watch sea basins. So definitely there is hope for that, but it's not at the it's not at the development phase of complete co-location yet.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up muses, which some of our colleagues are also working on, and regarding kind of a strategy for future co-location of activities. The muses action plan might be of interest to some of the participants today.
Yeah, even the business plans possibilities of some of these co-uses that might need some push financially or politically are worth looking at. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, maybe I'll throw one more question to you in the remaining couple of minutes regarding climate change. And I'm curious to hear about how MSP plans are addressing potential climate change events and their impacts on the spatial location of maritime activities.
Yes, so basically, climate change usually it's brought into MSP plans through some scenario analysis. So when they developed the draft plans of the MSP plans and they brought them into consultation, they sometimes some of the member states provide with some of these scenarios for different possibilities, and then they try to allocate their spatial plans with regards to that. Even though the conversations that we most of the time had with the MSP planners is that because MS plans are cyclic and they are assessed every 5 to 6 years, that the changes that climate change might bring into could also be foreseen into those cycles. So it is not that they will make dynamic MSP plans taking into account climate change, but they definitely will look at species distribution changes in order to avoid those kind of range shifts. But it could be also fixed while the cycle of the MSP plans are assessed.
Okay, yeah, thanks for that. Since you mentioned scenarios, that was also one of the topics discussed in the Visions Handbook and one of the questions from the Visions webinar. So there are examples in the Visions Handbook of particular tools that and methods that can be used for developing scenarios just to draw a connection between the various outputs of the MSP for Blue Growth study. So looking at the clock, I see we're right at 5. So I would like to say thank you very much to Marta for giving this great presentation today and answering our questions. And to all of you for joining. Once again, just a reminder that the next webinar in this series is coming up in 2 weeks on December 5th, which you can sign up for at the link in the slide that you see here. And of course, to please check out the MSP sector pages on the MSP platform website. Okay, thank you everyone and have a great evening. Take care.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.